Well, I'm fortunate in being asked here, and I'm very grateful to have the opportunity. And I'm also fortunate that the previous speaker has said things with which I am in entire agreement, even down to the, I think, fair assessment that the recovery in Britain's economic position in the 80s was not predominantly due to the European Union, but was predominantly due to many of the Thatcherite reforms, some of which I supported in the SDP, some of which I criticised. But I have no doubt that it was a transforming prime ministership, as the only other post-war transforming prime ministership was that of Clement Attlee. Now, I will, before I deal with foreign policy, just deal with this legal question and the importance of it. It was fine to pool sovereignty. I took that decision when I voted with 68 Labour MPs to join the European Union in 1971. But the extraordinary extent to which the Commission has sought to move into the nooks and crannies of British life was not predicted, and was actually rather foolish for the overall evolution, if it ever comes, on the continent of Europe, of a United States of Europe. My belief in the National Health Service is a very profound one. I do now think it would be almost impossible for a Labour government shaped in a direction of democratic socialism to reverse the marketisation of the National Health Service, given the EU legislation. Now, I know this is contentious, but I've studied it in some depth, and I do believe that when you change, if you like, the ethos of the National Health Service, rather like French railways, which the Commission doesn't intervene with, and you make it more marketised, more regulatory, then you bring a whole aspects of competitive and other aspects. I just touch on that. It matters a lot to me. I think it matters a lot to a lot of people, but I think it also matters to democracy. In our country, you change with a government, all policies up for grabs, and the National Health Service is one of those. And so except you can have a marketised health service designed largely bizarrely enough on your own healthcare system. That's their choice. But I want the choice to be able to reverse it. I don't think I have that choice any longer. Up until 10 years ago, I would never have said that. The other aspect is this Eurozone and the currency. It is a very different Europe. I would not be here arguing the case I do today to come out of it if that currency experiment had not taken place. And I would say in passing, I do think it is extraordinary how few Americans seem able, and the most recent is going to be, so we're told, President Obama, to put yourself in our position over the Eurozone. After all, you in America have failed to change the Eurozone every bit as much as we have. For the last 6 years, every single US Treasury Secretary and President has been using extraordinary degree of political effort and timing to make those changes, and you failed. And we in Britain have done exactly the same thing, and we have failed. There does come a moment when you have to look at the practical record of life. Now, let me deal with this issue of EU foreign policy and EU defence policy, which we would come out of straight away if we vote on the 23rd. And some people think to me this is extraordinary that I should be advocating it. Well, in the old days of political cooperation, consensus building and the way it developed in the 70s was a very worthwhile exercise as neighbours coming together and trying to combine a foreign policy and having dialogue. But the more it has taken on, the voting commitments, the more it has taken on the pretensions of being a country. And this is no better illustrated than serious examination of the EU-Ukraine accession agreement. This has been done to some extent in the journal published by Chatham House, where we've had 3 quite serious analytical looks at Ukraine. But any normal foreign policy, given all the problems of the breakup of the Soviet Union and the fragility of the Russian Federation, and with President Putin coming back for a 3rd term, fortunately separated by a period of years as Prime Minister, would have known that this issue of Ukraine was going to be absolutely crucial importance, because we were given warning of it in what happened in Georgia. It isn't as if we came to it blind. And thank goodness that it was Merkel who had the courage to stop us taking NATO into Georgia. Because when Georgia blew up in 2008, I actually think if we had been there, would not have been able to accept an Article 5 and intervene militarily. And incidentally the same if Ukraine had been inside NATO. But for the EU foreign policy, this was a big test. And what have they done? Read the treaty. I'm not going to read it out to you. But look at Article 4, look at Article 5, look at Article 10, and you will see a wording which is deliberately provocative. It's as if it's saying, we in Europe can do what NATO can't do. NATO is not going to go in Ukraine, but we will go in with our European defense policy. No wonder it was provocative. No wonder it produced it. And the only wonder, actually, is we've ended up with I say just, the annexation of Crimea, which is an outrage and something directly against the Budapest Memorandum, which your country, if those are Americans in the audience, and Britain signed. I could explain why, but just this. Remember the massive transfer of nuclear weapons and missiles to the Russian Federation from the Ukraine. And now what is the lesson for the world? That if you want to stop being invaded, you better keep on to nuclear weapons and nuclear missiles. It's as clear as daylight, and it is the biggest single blow to the Non-Proliferation Treaty that has been ever administered. And the core issue of it lies with EU foreign policy. And don't let's escape those facts. They are facts now. And then you look at the situation. British influence. I'm told that the British Prime Minister knew of the President Hollande and Chancellor Merkel's intervention in Minsk was when they were on the plane. We're told that nobody quite knows whether it was an EU foreign policy that was operating in the 24 hours before the elected president of Ukraine left the country. But all we do know is that what was produced by the 2 EU foreign ministers from France and Germany and the Polish foreign minister was that we got a compromise, signed it up, was called an EU agreement, but the ink wasn't dry before we gave it up because of demonstrations in the street. That's no way to form a foreign policy. Examine this very carefully, because if this goes on, then those of us who think that there are similarities, I would say it's 1912, but certainly 1913, apparently Juncker has said as well, that's the period of history that worries me. Now let's come to defense. And here again, I do think it ill behoves the United States that has posed every single aspect of the initial agreement produced by Tony Blair and Chirac at Saint-Malo to keep saying to us that we should carry on with this myth of a European Union defense. This again is very, very dangerous. Don't underestimate it. Don't underestimate, and I would just read one little piece because it came as a surprise to me when I read it. in Gates's memoirs, he recalls a discussion with the NATO Secretary General Rasmussen, and Rasmussen tells him that the reason the Germans are not going to support anything involved being Libya is they want it done by the European Union. And in General Richards's memoirs, he says that he was adamant with David Cameron that if this was going to be done, it had to be done through NATO. And both David Cameron was sympathetic to it, and Sarkozy was openly arguing for it done as the European Union. Now, there are lessons for America over Libya, which it's encouraging for President Obama has openly admitted his mistakes in the aftermath. And certainly, I was advocate of the no-fly zone. I have made mistakes in both Iraq and mistakes in Libya, and I was determined we didn't make the same mistakes in Syria, and I believe that President Obama, by not going to war because the word red line had been used, showed remarkable sagacity. And I think it has been already shown to be a correct decision. But what this all indicates is NATO is much weaker than it used to be in all our countries. You've only got to listen and watch the debates in this country to know that holding NATO will be a very difficult issue for the next decade or more. And I believe Britain does have a preeminent role in doing this. And it will not worry me one little bit if we have no EU foreign policy or EU defence policy, if, as I hope and expect, that the British government will put its resources, its energy and its efforts into making NATO a credible organisation. Because believe me, there is one urgent need, and that is that President Putin understands that behaving as he did over Georgia and over Ukraine in any of the three Baltic states would create an Article 5 situation. I'm not sure that NATO understands that, let alone President Putin. And it's extremely important over the next decade or more that this comes into being. And what does this all mean for those of you who don't follow these things, and nor should you? Let me read you the statement that came out on the 28th of March 2001 from the French Chief of Staff. If the EU works properly, it will start working on crises at a very early stage, well before the situation escalates. NATO has nothing to do with this. At a certain stage, the Europeans would decide to conduct a military operation. Either the Americans would come in or not. At one stage before Nice, we had the ridiculous situation of British officials going round to try and get the Dutch and the Germans to act for them on insisting that NATO planning be given the central position. This is all about autonomous decision-making. It's all about trying to take the politics of pretension, which is the besetting sin of the European Union, into NATO. The EU at the moment, I believe to be a dysfunctional organization, largely as a result of the collapse of the Eurozone's policies. If that goes into NATO, then there will be a very, very serious situation. It's not fashionable to talk about military organizations these days. Newport, a decision was taken that all member states would increase their budget to 2%. We now also realize from what President Obama has said that he had quite a difficulty in persuading the British that if special relationship was to mean anything, that commitment had to be fulfilled. And I'm glad that our Prime Minister has fulfilled it and will fulfill it. But that's just the start. Many won't. And we have a very serious threat in many, many different areas, which I don't need to explain or arrange to an audience like this. So don't go on with this illusion in the United States that it's a good thing for the way that the foreign policy has developed and the defense policy of the European Union. There are serious dangers within it, and we need to face up to it. Now, it's not the prime reason for me believing that Britain should leave. None of these are, except for the dysfunctionality of the whole aspect and the fact that very unusually the people of this country have a choice in a referendum. This referendum has not been given to the people of Britain. They have fought for it. They have fought for it over 20 years against sometimes people like me arguing against some actions of them. The elite have been constantly pressured to either, first of all, take the euro as an issue for a referendum, but on many, many aspects of dissatisfaction with the European Union, the politicians have been positioned and forced, and this referendum is the people's referendum. And now they are going to have to choose. It's a very complex issue on such a big issue. But Nigel finally is right. They don't have to spell it all out and understand it, but in their bones they know what this is a choice about. This is a fork in the road. We have to decide the direction of travel. Are we prepared to go into a situation where the solution to the Eurozone crisis is undoubtedly a United States of Europe, and one which we want to see solved, but we do not wish to be participants in, and we will be sucked into it, both, if we lose this referendum. That's the choice of the people. I will live with it and accept it. But this is not a light choice. This is not a choice that can be changed. We will come out of the European Union if this vote is taken. This government will take us out. We in the campaign can't plan for every negotiation, answer every question about every trade agreement. That is going to be done over a transitional period by the present government, which has a majority and in a fixed term has got 4 years to run. That juxtaposition of events, with no general election interfering, is almost unique. And it's one which we will have to rely on and need to take us through the transition period. So maybe there are risks, but when I think, having lived through what I've seen for the last 5 years in Greece, what will be the risks of a collapse of the Eurozone involving, say, 8 or 9 countries, but including Italy, then the risks that we take by making an orderly and a transitional period to come out of the present structures is as nothing.